Well, it's 2 minutes past 10, so I would like to start. Just from my end here, welcome to this first Techruption event that is completely organized in a virtual environment. For the new people, my name is Peter Custos. I'm the program manager of Techruption. Techruption, the innovation and co-creation program of the Brightlands Smart Services Campus in Heerlen. The program usually organizes events and facilitates co-creation in the area of data and smart services. And we do that with physical events on the campus in Heerlen. I hear an echo. Other people can. Here we go. Yeah, here we go. I still hear an echo, but I will talk through it. It will only be 1 minute before I give the word to Martin anyway. So what I was trying to say, the program usually organizes events and facilitates co-creation. We do that usually with physical events in Heerlen on one of the Brightlands campuses. Unfortunately, the Corona safety measures have dictated that we cannot have these physical events anymore for obvious reasons, and therefore we're moving everything online. And this is quite an experiment. This is the first ideation that we host online. And we've been working very hard to make this possible, and I've full trust that we will make this also very valuable in an online setting. In the context of Corona, I would also like to take this opportunity to emphasize that I hope that for all of you and your close ones, you will stay safe and healthy. It has a big impact for all of us, and yeah, we make the best out of it. Also in relation to the Techruption and Techruption events. So coming back to that, about the event today, this is the first session of 2. So usually we have bigger events. Now we cut them up in more smaller events to make it feasible to put it online. So this is the first one of 2 that will touch upon the topic of blockchain and the balance between transparency and confidentiality. The next one will be on April 7, so please make sure to register for that as well if you're interested in this topic. But first today, and for that I give the virtual floor to Maarten Everts and Erik Wijtenberg of TNO, who will host this session. Maarten, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Okay, so now you should be able to hear me. So yeah, okay. Then I have to find my slides. There are my slides. Okay. Good. Yeah. So like Peter said, this is a bit experimental. Maybe things don't go exactly as planned, but we'll see. We'll make a good session out of it. So, transparency versus confidentiality, that is the topic of today. And it's all new with this online stuff. And for that, I would like to experiment with some interaction possibilities. So I would like to ask all of you to go to slido.com and use the event code Y42. Some of you already have found this, I think. And I would like to ask you to give yourself a name so that I can give you the floor when necessary, so I can call out. I will introduce the topic in a bit. But let's try something now with the interaction possibilities. Let's do a poll. And this is just the first poll to see what happens. So How would you rate your blockchain knowledge? I see people voting very good, as I think most of you can see this as well. Wow, this actually works quite well. So I think 13 is also the number of people who are now here, right? 14 apparently, okay, yeah. Okay, so most of you have intermediate knowledge of blockchain. Okay, that helps me also in well, making sure that my story matches my audience. Okay, so that was a first poll. You know what, let's do another one. And I'm just wondering, why are you joining this session? What is it that drew you to this session? And just be brief, and we will see as if things were properly your answers here on the screen. Okay, I see the first one. You can see all the answers coming in, very good. Better understanding of GDPR, okay. Good, okay, I like these answers, thank you, thank you. Okay, as you can see, I'm reading along, and I must say that it is a bit weird talking like this, knowing that you can all see and hear me, but that the interaction is all this digital. Well, we'll see how this goes. Okay, so thanks for your answers. That's very helpful. This same platform, Slido, we will use as means to do some Q&As. So if you have questions during while I'm talking or other people are talking, you can use this tool to ask questions, and they will pop up. Eric Wijkenberg, he will give me a virtual punch if there's a question there. But do ask questions while we have this session, just to keep this interactive and fun. And if necessary, I might ask you to tell some more about this question using audio, if that is better. Okay. Any questions at this point, maybe? And you can use Slido. 5, 4, 3, 1. No, then let's just dive in. Okay. We will dive into this topic of confidentiality versus transparency. And the main goal for me is to make sure that we're on the same page and that we know about the same things. And one of those things is, okay, blockchain. What do you mean with blockchain? Well, I will be very brief there because most of you know all this. And then I will dive more into some motivation, and then I will steer towards potential solutions to find this balance. And then we're gonna wrap up. So, a very brief blockchain primer. This is very brief and very opinionated, so bear with me. So, blockchain was, of course, quite a hype. You all know this, and now we're approaching that it's not as much of a hype. And we went through the curve, and maybe we're already a bit here. We went through the trough of disillusionment, now we really want to apply this. But when we want to apply this blockchain, well, we might run into indeed these confidentiality problems. And what is a blockchain? Well, people have different views on this. David Siegel, for example, says that a blockchain is a shared ledger that everyone trusts to be accurate forever. And that is one way to look at it. I often also like the economic view on a blockchain where, well, if two parties want to interact or trade, then they often rely on a third party to take away these uncertainty. And well, that could be like the police, banks, the justice system. However, of course, these trusted third parties have a lot of power and they could be corrupted. And one view at the blockchain is that you replace such a trusted third party with a lot of power with a network, assuming that the majority of this network is honest and not as corruptible. Of course, you cannot replace all trusted third parties here, but that is one way to look at it. From a technical point of view, you can also just look at, well, basically it's a blockchain is a set of cooperating computers with distinct owners that might have opposing interests, but still manage to work together. And Bitcoin is the main example of it. I also see a question coming in. I can immediately answer this. Yes, the slides will be shared afterwards. A PDF we will share. And also this session will be recorded, so that's another way to use this. And then there's of course the term blockchain. Well, there are many ways to look at this and what is a blockchain, what is a distributed ledger? Well, I will not go into that here, but know that there is not yet that much agreement on what exactly is a blockchain and what should one call a ledger, etc., etc. I will postpone that for now, that discussion. Of course, it all started with Bitcoin, but there's also Ethereum. As you all know, Ethereum is one way to look at it is a world computer on which you run these smart contracts and these tiny applications. And the funny thing about smart contracts is that they're neither smart or a contract. Even Vitalik said as much, that he thought it was a bad name. He liked, at this point said, well, maybe we should call it a persistent script. But anyway, they're here now. And they give this uncorruptible third party its code. It just does as specified, and this way it can be this incorruptible third party. But in the end, like I said, it's just code. Okay, having said that, why this session? So if you look at blockchain, one view is there is a shared truth among several parties. And one way to look at it is as a shared spreadsheet with all kinds of data. It's distributed, it's auditable, it's transparent, everybody can see it, everybody can trust it. And if you look at Bitcoin, that's indeed the case. You have this huge graph of inputs and outputs in these transactions, and these form a large transaction graph. And in Bitcoin specifically, they use the unspent transaction output model, where your balance is all the sum of your unspent transaction outputs. And all this information is in this blockchain. You can use block explorers and you can see this is a relatively recent one. You can see all the transactions in here, you can see the amounts, etc. You can really follow the money. And Bitcoin is of course pseudonymous. You all know this by now, it's not anonymous. In the beginning people thought, well, that's close enough to anonymous, so they used it for online markets where you could buy all kinds of interesting material, and you could pay with Bitcoin, thinking that it might be anonymous. Of course, by now we know that this huge graph gives a lot of traceability, and you typically don't really have fungibility anymore, where some Bitcoins are more clean than others. I will come back to that in a bit, but you can do all kinds of analysis on Bitcoin. One of the answers which the community responded is to create more privacy-oriented cryptocurrencies. Here you see a couple. Actually, some of them are horribly broken, so don't use them. Some were broken in a funny way where you could almost create unlimited money without anyone knowing. But the most interesting ones here, I think, are Zcash, Monero, and Grin. But I will get back to that in a bit. But there's more motivation. Suppose now you would like to create a so-called Dutch auction in a smart contract. And you would say, well, smart contract would be good for that. And to remind you, in a Dutch auction, people send in their bids, and then the highest one, of course, wins, but they only have to pay the amount that the amount before them was bidded. Okay, so suppose that the highest bid was $100, but there was also a bid of $80, then the winner only has to pay $80. But how would you do this in a smart contract if everyone can see all the transactions and all the bids? Well, there are some solutions for that, but we'll get to that. But maybe you're making a smart contract that offers services for those older than 18. And you only have certified date of birth. But of course the date of birth leaves a lot of information. Actually, you only need to know that someone is older than 18. What can you use there? There are solutions for that as well. Then of course in logistics, I can imagine all kinds of use cases where on the one hand you want to be able to check things, but on the other hand, lots of this information is confidentiality, is very sensitive, and you want to keep that confidential. For example, your competitors might know how much you ship. Similar in the provenance of food, some people say, well, you can really use a blockchain to follow the food, for example, that these grapes are really biological, and have a trace of this where you can see where it all comes from, that you have this provenance graph basically. But then, of course, there are also many questions. What about the privacy of this little small farmer in Chile? Well, this is one individual farmer. Why should everybody see how much he sells, how much money he basically has? But this also holds for bigger parties. Why should the competitor know the volume of how much I export, or even the price? Even though that might be used and relevant for transactions in such a system. And if you have a certifier, for example, that certifies these are biological grapes, should everybody be able to know this certifier, and then maybe threaten him if he doesn't certify something or did certify something of a competitor? So in many of these cases, you will run into situations where you basically do not, on the one hand, want to be able to check something, and on the other hand, this information is sensitive. Can we find this balance? And let's do something interactive again. I would like to know what your experiences are. In this blockchain projects maybe you did where you've had to find this balance, and I would like to hear some interesting use cases. So I'll open the poll again, and to ask you whether you experienced any confidentiality and privacy problems in blockchain projects.
Martin, Peter here. There were some people coming in a bit late. Can you briefly explain how they can join as well?
Okay, for the questions.
Yeah, exactly. For Slido.
Okay. Yeah. So if you go to slido.com, thank you, Peter, and enter the Y42 event code, then you can participate in the interactive aspects of this deep dive. That is also an interesting answer. Thank you. Uh-huh. I'll let you type a bit more. I see someone say that they store confidential and privacy data off-chain. Indeed, that is one of the easiest solutions that also I often point to. One of you says that isn't that the essence of going for permissionless or private blockchains? Well, that is one aspect of it, but also in permission blockchains or private blockchains, whatever you call it. Also there you might not fully trust your partners that they see everything. So even there you might need solutions to solve this confidentiality problem. The deletion problem, oh yeah, I haven't even touched upon that here, but indeed that's also a thing. Okay, so I think most of you who wanted to say something said something. Let's then move on. I'm someone with a technical background. Of course I will look for technology to help me solve this problem. There are of course many non-technical solutions to this problem. Be it legislation, etc. But in this session I will mostly look at the technical ones. But there are, of course, other solutions. And just to check, cryptography is one of my main tools for this, and I just want to check with you how your cryptographic knowledge is, just to make sure that I don't tell too much or too little in the upcoming slides. So if you would could vote here, then Okay, you all agree quite a bit. Basic cryptographic knowledge. It's good to see that there's also someone who does cryptographic proofs for breakfast. Good. So that person can correct me if I say things that are wrong. Okay, thank you. Let's move back to the presentation. I will now touch upon a couple of cryptographic building blocks that help in solving this problem. First, of course, there's the hash function. That is also often misunderstood, but what it is, in essence, it is a function, hence the name, that takes any input, arbitrarily sized output input, and maps that to a fixed size bit string, which is fascinating because there are of course infinitely many inputs and they all map to a finite set of values. Of course, this finite set is still quite big, but there theoretically could be collisions. But the cool thing about hash function is that these are very hard to find. The output of a hash function is sometimes called a hash code or a hash volume digest or hash output. That's what I will call it every now and then. And they have three cool properties that are one-way, second preimage resistant, and collision resistant. Of course, you can imagine what I mean with one-way, so that it's you can compute a hash for an input, say blockchain tag, and outcome the hash, that it is difficult to invert the hash function. Of course, you can check whether this maps to the same hash, but you cannot easily go back. Then there's the second preimage resistant, that suppose you have the hash of one output, that it is very hard to find a second input that hashes to that same value. And finally, there's the collision resistant, that it should be just difficult, computationally infeasible to just find any two inputs with the same hash value. And these are very useful. You've seen they're used a lot in the blockchain world, of course, as you know, particularly in the permissionless ones where it's used for the proof of work aspects, but they're all interesting use for hashes. And I will now dive into one of them in a hash-based commitment scheme, which for some use cases in the blockchain world is already enough to get what you want. And for this, to illustrate this, I will look into how you would do rock, paper, scissors over the phone. I assume that most of you know rock, paper, scissors. And before I go into that, I see there's a question. Let's see. Indeed, if you would use a hash function, indeed, that's a good point. I hear someone ask or say that, well, some people hash private input, for example, the BSN, and they say, well, it's hashed, but of course, the number of BSNs is limited, so you can indeed just brute force all BSNs and then find out which one it is. So indeed, that is a problem that I will also illustrate with this rock, paper, scissors example, because suppose you want to use a hash function to play rock, paper, scissors over the phone. And as you all know, paper beats rock, rock beats scissors, and scissors beats paper. If you do this over the phone and start talking at the same time, this won't work. And then indeed a question for yourself is, why is simply hashing your choice not enough? You could technically say, well, I will pick rock and then hash this and then tell the hash. Of course, the other person on the other hand has three options and just can also hash the same value and then find out what you said. So, and that the same holds for personal data. So how would you do this by phone? Well, you can use a hash-based commitment scheme. Suppose Alice and Bob want to do this. Alice picks a value, rock for example, but she also picks a random bit string, and then she hashes both the random bit string and her pick, rock in this case. She sends the output of that hash, which is called the commitment, to Bob, and because of the cool one-way property of a hash function, Bob cannot invert that value C to determine what Alice picked, so he cannot pick a value that always makes him win. He then sends paper back to Alice, and then Alice of course knows whether she has lost or won. Suppose she has lost, she cannot now change her original pick because of the second preimage resistant property, because she cannot find another input value that also hashes to the original commitment that she sent earlier. So her only option is to send R, her random value, and her pick rock, and then of course Bob checks this by hashing this R that Alice sent and the value that she picked, and if they're the same, he knows Alice didn't cheat. Of course, there's still room for Alice to cheat when she just says, oh, sorry, I didn't get your original message, and then says, let's try again. But leave that out of the way for now. So you can have very simple commitments where you, for example, state something. You don't have to reveal anything yet, but you can always at a later time be asked to show what you really picked, and you cannot cheat afterwards. So they're simple but effective, and they could be useful in many of these problems where you want to have this balance between transparency and confidentiality, where you first commit to something, you don't reveal it yet, but at a later stage you can be asked to reveal it, but you cannot cheat anymore, but you still keep your privacy most of the time. Of course, there's also Merkle trees. Most of you will know this, so I will be brief here. You can have these, so the basic idea is you have, these are the input values, the data blocks, you hash those, and then you take two, and then you hash actually the two hashes together to get a new hash, and you do this all the way to the top, to the Merkle root. And then the cool thing is that if you want to prove that a certain value, say this block here was in this set, then you only have to reveal this value, this value, this value, and this value, without actually having to reveal the rest. And you can still check whether a certain item, say a transaction, is in a block. Of course, that doesn't help in all confidentiality problems, but in some. Questions so far? And I have, of course, our slide do thing to no questions? Good, then we'll move on. So these are the basic building blocks. Of course, there's also regular encryption. I just assume that you know what I mean with this, where you can encrypt something and then only give out the keys to those who should be able to decrypt it, and ta-da, it works. But there's also Zcash, and I told you about Bitcoin, that it has this nice graph where you can see a lot, and basically Zcash is an attempt to have money that is actually anonymous, that gives way more privacy. And they have the coolest domain name ever, of course. I wonder how they got it, but it's very cool. The cool thing about Zcash is that it hides three things. It hides the sender, the recipient, and the amount. And still you have money. And basically what happens is you submit transactions, and the input contains zero knowledge that your transaction is valid, and also an output that contains how to be able to spend this. But all these transactions are not linked as in Bitcoin. In Bitcoin you have this UTXO graph that links all transactions, but in Zcash it's a black box. You cannot see anything. And so you have only these commitments to valid coins and some nullifiers to make sure that you cannot spend things twice, and all these transactions contain this zero knowledge proof that it's a valid transaction. And what do you then prove in this transaction? Well, three things. First, that the coins should not have been spent before. Second, that the sender is actually authorized to spend the coins, so it has actually the key material, it's the owner of the coins, and that the transaction inputs equal transaction outputs. And if you have these three things, if you can prove these three things, the transaction is accepted by the nodes of the blockchain, which is in itself quite fascinating. And well, indeed, that's the only thing that needs to be proven. The nodes do not need to know the exact amount. They only need to know that you're not creating money out of thin air, that you are actually authorized to spend. And this way you can really indeed protect the sender, receiver, and the amount. How do they do this? They use so-called ZK snarks, which is a funny name, and it stands for Zero Knowledge Succinct Non-Interactive Arguments of Knowledge. Quite a mouthful, but very powerful as well. The succinct part is actually refers to the fact that the proof is always very short. No matter what you want to be able to prove, the proof is always, in this case, 288 bytes, and verifying this proof only takes 5 milliseconds. So checking certain transaction is very Tim has an excellent point. I will get back to that in a bit. So these shielded transactions, as they call it in Zcash, they were quite computationally intensive. It took more than 37 seconds to create such a zero knowledge proof, and a lot of RAM. Luckily, recently they upgraded Zcash to something called SAPLING, which has way faster proof creation and less memory use, and then it can actually use in mobile, for example. And now to get back to Tim's note, indeed, that the default in Zcash, because in Zcash they have indeed transparent transactions and shielded transaction, and the default is transparent, and the number of transactions in the shielded was at a certain point only 3%. So the anonymity set is like very small. If you compare this to, say, another privacy coin such as Monero, which is privacy by default, then your anonymity set is way bigger. Of course, Monero has a different way of approaching privacy. It's sometimes called a decoy-based approach. It doesn't have as much privacy as Zcash has, but it is indeed private by default, and this way gives, indeed, like Tim said, bigger anonymity set. So I talked about zero knowledge and also in these snarks, but what is now a zero knowledge proof? Well, if you look at Wikipedia, it says that it's a method for which one party, the prover, can prove to another party, the verifier, that they know a value X, which is the secret, without conveying any information apart from the fact that they know the value x, which is a bit abstract, but it is what a zero-knowledge proof is. This is the typical example. Many of you will know this, but I will explain it anyway. This is the story of a cave of Alibaba. Here you have two people, Victor and Peggy, and a cave. And this is a very special cave. It's circular, and here there's a door. It is a special door where only if you know the secret phrase you can enter it. Peggy here claims that she knows the secret and wants to prove this to Victor. So what she now does, she goes into the cave, picks side A or B. Then Victor also goes into the cave and then shouts, he picks A or B and then shouts, for example, in this case, A, and then asks Peggy to come out of side A. And indeed, when she managed to do so, he knows that, well, she probably knows the secret for that door. However, she also could be lucky. Of course, she could be lucky, so then she goes, you do this again, and again, and again, and if she managed to prove time and time again that she comes out of the right exit, then Victor, well, then probably indeed Peggy knows the secret. So I see a question, let me quickly read it. Indeed, so the question was whether you leak the thing you want to prove. Indeed, so yeah, one of you asked the question of if you show that you're older than 18, well then indeed you at least leak that information, that you're older than 18. You might not leak your birthday indeed, but the thing that you want to prove indeed, of course, you do leak. Thank you. Another example is Yahoo's millionaire's problem, where two millionaires, they want to prove to one another that the one is richer than the other without exactly revealing how much they are worth. In essence, that is also a two-party computation, but you can use a zero-knowledge proof for that as well. So it's a powerful building block, and my gut feeling says that it is very useful in many use cases where you want to be able to check something, or that something is automatically checked by machines, but you don't actually need all the details to be available, just a proof that something is correct. And that is also one of the reasons to start this, because I want to explore this further, whether these zero-knowledge proofs can actually be used in a use case to solve concrete problems. But we'll get back to that. So these set case snarks are a powerful building block, and a while ago this was also put into Ethereum, where you have basically pre-compiled contracts that you can use to use this building block. And people have basically used this Zcash technology and put it in there. And here you can see that, well, in 2016 already, people talked about that and did some proof of concepts. There's also Socrates, which is a toolbox for ZK snarks in Ethereum. So it gives you a toolbox to use this verifiable computation, basically what it is, to give more privacy to your dApps. And it's been around for a while, and we looked at it a bit, but our feeling is it's not used that much. For example, here in 2018 already, someone did a proof of concept on private DAI transactions using ZK snarks, but that didn't go much further. And recently there was this Hacker Noon blog post that states that why snarks are the technology of the coming decade. It was published last month. So many people see potential in it, but it isn't used that much yet. And of course it's complex technology. But I'm also very much have the feeling that this could be very useful, but I want to explore this in a cool use case. Okay, so these are the crypto aspects. Before I move on to confidentiality and permission blockchains, maybe I give you some room to maybe ask some more questions. Indeed, good point, Tim. The technology that Sovrin also uses is another aspect is they built their credential thing on EDMX, which is basically also zero knowledge proof, like IRMA is. These are also zero knowledge proofs where you basically prove that you know a secret without the other person learning everything. And for example, learning your full credential, but only parts of your credential. Good point. Any other questions? And the funny thing about this system, I cannot hear you say no, but all right, let's move on then. So, of course, you can use cryptography to solve your confidentiality problem, but you can also use the way you architecture your thing to solve this problem, and that's what often is used in permissioned blockchains. For example, Hyperledger Fabric, and one of the more famous permissioned blockchains. Also in their video, they talk about problems regarding confidentiality, where some tomatoes are sold and you don't want everyone to know the good price that you gave them. And they have 3 privacy mechanisms in Hyperledger Fabric: channels, private transactions, and zero knowledge proof technologies. Here you see them again, these zero knowledge proof technologies. In these channels, they can offer, well, for a group of people, certain, a virtual blockchain that has its own access rules. That is one way, which is more architectural, I think. They also have private transactions where only certain people are able to read using cryptography transactions, and the zero knowledge proof that I talked about earlier. They also use that here. They can use it for client authentication, where they indeed also use the same EDMX technology, where you can prove parts of your credential that you are, for example, a member, and then you can access it. But they also plan in an upcoming release so-called zero knowledge asset transfer, and there they give you more privacy for asset transfer. I haven't seen that in action yet, but I'm very curious how well this works, and I will get to that in a bit. Then there's Quorum, which is also a permission blockchain. They also have their several privacy features. They have their recently added Z-Ether, which hides the transactions and the amounts, or the interactions, or sorry, the connections between the transactions. They also have this feature of private members of smart contracts, where they have a special privacy processor in the field. And Corda is another one that is often used in a permission setting. Here they say, well, they already looked at this from the beginning. They said, well, that they planned for confidential entities and change snipping, and they said, well, we make it so that at a certain point, zero knowledge proof can be added when the technology fully matures. And they say that they already have proof of concept using this. And before I go to the poll, I see another question. And this is a question for Tim. Do you mean, let's see. Maybe Tim, let's do some two-way audio. Maybe Tim, you can explain this to Stefan.
So Evernym, I think the sister company of Sovrin, they made it so that credentials stored in your wallet are invalid by default. So you need the credential hash to prove that the credential is still valid. And the issuer can revoke the credential hash, and therefore the credentials are made useless. So for instance, your driver license could be a credential, and issuers can revoke that when you throw a trunk, for instance. And then you can use a zero knowledge proof. Yeah.
I try to be a good host and mute myself when the other person is talking. I forgot to unmute myself. So thank you, Erik. So I want to ask you, in another poll, what your experiences are in permission blockchains regarding these privacy features. And apparently this poll is missing, so I'll just do this in the with the regular questions. Could you maybe, if you have experience with these privacy features of, for example, Hyperledger or Quorum, whether they worked well or whether they solved your problem, etc. Okay, thank you, Tim. Other experiences? Okay, thank you, Stefan. I was wondering, what do you mean with confidential transaction? And maybe you can, if you want to, you can say this with your microphone. What do you mean with confidential transaction?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm using confidential transactions in Elements, which is the Bitcoin sidechain, and there you can keep your transactions with tokens only confidential with the issuer and the receiver, and the amount are confidential. But you can also give out an unblinding key, which gives, for example, the government the opportunities to see what is transacted. But this unblind key is, if it's given to other persons or other people, also gives them the possibility to see the transactions. I'm wondering whether zero knowledge could give a helping hand in that case.
That is
How do I mute? Yeah.
okay, thanks. Indeed, that could help. You also see that in Zcash, where they have viewing keys, and also in Monero, where you can give other people keys so that they at least can view what the transactions are, what the transactions are for a certain wallet, so to speak. But indeed, if you unblind it, they can see all the transaction and see the specific transaction. But I think that there are ways with cryptography to give some control on who can see what, or that they can only see a certain transaction, not all. And that's the cool thing about cryptography. You can combine these building blocks to make such solutions. But how exactly? Well, that something that is interesting to explore. Well, I am quite on time. I have one final thing that is more architectural, and that is maybe going off-chain. Some of you already mentioned this, that maybe one of the best solutions to balance privacy and confidentiality is just not to put any confidential information on the chain. And that is, of course, a very wise move. And that is also the first one I would explore. And I'm very curious how people do this. But another way is to, in the permissionless world, and I was wondering whether we can take some inspiration from that in the permissioned world, is going off-chain using a Lightning Network. I assume most of you by now know about the Lightning Network for Bitcoin, where you basically use the blockchain only in case of conflict, as a fallback. And it starts with setting up payment channels between Alice and Bob, where they basically, between parties, in this case Alice and Bob, where they have this payment channel where they continuously change the balance between them, and they not submit this to the blockchain. They just trust each other enough, and the way they do this is by making this is grossly simplified, but making half transactions partially signed and giving that to the other person, so that, in this case, for example, Alice can always run through the blockchain and get her money back if Bob stops responding or starts misbehaving. And all these changes, basically, they not have to go to the blockchain. And it is basically a scaling solution. And if you then link all these payment channels, you can have money flow through these payment channels. I will not go into detail, you can read about this elsewhere. And this way you can have nice, scalable, low fee transactions. Some people are still questioning whether it can really scale, but it's now being implemented, and there's a whole Lightning network of nodes and channels. This is a live view of this Lightning network. And also for Ethereum, they have such state channels developed that basically, well, you trade a bit of certainty with time, and that in the end you can get your money back, and you fall back to the blockchain of that platform. And a side effect is that you have more privacy, because not all transactions land on the blockchain that is publicly visible. Only the people who are involved in this linked set of payment channels can see the transactions, not everybody. And this gives more privacy. And I was wondering whether some of you have already explored the idea of, well, this is of course a very permissionless technology, and these payment channels, also with their possibilities to do atomic cross-chain swaps, but would they make sense in a permissioned blockchain setting? And I'm just wondering, what do you think? Most of you say yes. Interesting. I sometimes do have the gut feeling, well, it might work, but on the other hand, would it really make sense? For those of you who voted no, maybe in the question thing, you can state why you say no. I also noticed that there are some new people. If you want to interact here, you can go to slido.com and use the event code Y42. I don't see much input here, so here. Main reason. Tim, you have a good point. Of course, yeah, you could look at this as a Lightning Network as indeed a side channel, but of all of these off-chain things, indeed it's mostly for scaling, and indeed how much scaling do you really need for permissioned blockchains? Well, but it can help sometimes for privacy features, but I'm myself not sure. That's why I asked you people about your opinion. If there are no further input, let's move on. So these were a couple of explorations into this problem of finding, on the one hand, transparency, what blockchain often gives you, together with auditability, and on the other hand, that you often also want privacy and confidentiality, and that in most cases when you made your cool proof of concept, then you realize, all this information that is used on this blockchain or in this smart contract is actually sensitive, and I do not want everybody this to know. So how do we find this balance? And that is something that I really would like to explore in a next session. But this gave you basically some settings and approaches that are there, and I want to explore with you in the next session how well they are usable in practice.